Chapter 1: The Art of Letting Go. Hey there, friend. Welcome to Better Self Audiobook. Today, we're diving into something that might just change the way you see your entire life. We're talking about the 5 Japanese rules for discipline. And trust me, by the end of this journey, you'll understand why these simple principles have transformed millions of lives across the globe. It was 10:47 p.m. on a cold Tuesday evening. The fluorescent lights of St. Michael's Medical Center buzzed softly in the critical care unit. The atmosphere was thick with that peculiar hospital silence, the kind that gets interrupted only by the occasional beep of monitors and the soft shuffle of footsteps down sterile corridors. Emma Torres, a 28-year-old intensive care nurse, was halfway through her 3rd consecutive night shift. Dark circles had begun to settle under her eyes like unwelcome guests. Her shoulders carried a weight that had nothing to do with the physical demands of her job. If you looked closely, you could see it in the way she moved, slightly mechanical, going through the motions, but not really present. Emma had always loved nursing. From the moment she'd pinned on that badge 5 years ago, she'd felt a sense of purpose that most people spend their whole lives searching for. This wasn't just a career to her. It was a calling. She genuinely believed she was making a difference, one patient at a time. But somewhere along the way, something had shifted. The spark that once lit her up from the inside had dimmed to barely a flicker. The daily grind of 12-hour shifts, the emotional toll of watching patients suffer, the administrative paperwork that never seemed to end. It all started blending together into one exhausting blur. She felt like she was drowning in responsibility, suffocating under expectations, both from others and from herself. Every day felt the same. Check vitals, administer medications, update charts, comfort families, rinse and repeat. The job that once filled her with meaning now just filled her with fatigue. In bed 14 of the ICU, there was a patient who'd been there for almost 2 weeks. His name was Walter Chen, a 67-year-old retired architect who'd undergone triple bypass surgery. Unlike many patients who had streams of visitors throughout the day, Walter rarely had company. His daughter would drop by occasionally, usually staying no more than 20 minutes before rushing off to whatever demanded her attention next. Walter was a quiet man. He didn't complain about the discomfort, didn't make demands of the staff, didn't press the call button unless absolutely necessary. But there was something about his eyes. They held depth, a kind of wisdom that comes only from living fully and thinking deeply. It was as if he was always observing, always processing, always understanding something that others missed. One night, as Emma approached his bed to check his medication drip, Walter's voice broke through the mechanical sounds of the ICU. It was soft but clear. "Excuse me, what's your name?" Emma glanced up, slightly surprised. Most patients in the ICU were too uncomfortable or medicated to make small talk. "Emma," she replied with a professional smile. "Emma Torres." "That's a beautiful name," Walter said, and then, as quickly as he'd spoken, he fell silent again. From that night forward, something changed. Every time Emma came to check on Walter, he'd try to engage her in conversation. At first, it was just simple pleasantries. How was her day? Was she from the city? But gradually, as the nights passed, Walter began opening up in ways that surprised her. He told her about his architecture firm, about the buildings he'd designed that still stood downtown. He shared stories about his late wife, Maria, and how they'd met at a gallery opening 40 years ago. He talked about his regrets, the choices he wished he'd made differently, the relationships he'd let slip away because he'd been too focused on his career. Emma found herself lingering by his bedside longer than necessary. There was something therapeutic about these conversations, something that filled a void she hadn't even realized existed. In a strange way, they were forming a friendship. Not the typical nurse-patient relationship, but something more genuine, more human. It was on a particularly difficult night, after Emma had lost a young patient earlier in her shift, that Walter noticed the heaviness in her movements. "You okay, Emma?" he asked gently. She wanted to say yes, to maintain that professional boundary, but something about Walter's presence made her honest. "Just tired, I guess. Sometimes this job feels like too much." Walter nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that answer. "Can I tell you something I learned the hard way?" He didn't wait for her response. "Life is like a room. Over time, we accumulate things in that room. Some of them are valuable, truly important. But most of them, they're just clutter. Objects we picked up along the way without really thinking about whether we needed them." Emma pulled up a chair, her curiosity piqued. "The problem," Walter continued, "is that we rarely take the time to sort through it all, to figure out what matters and what doesn't. So the clutter builds up, and pretty soon we can't even move freely in our own space. We get trapped by our own accumulation." He gestured weakly toward the ICU around them. "Think about this place. If you filled this unit with every piece of equipment the hospital owns, whether it's needed here or not, could you do your job effectively?" Emma shook her head. "It would be chaos. I wouldn't be able to find anything or move quickly in an emergency." "Exactly," Walter said. "That's what happens in our lives, too. We need to sort. We need to make conscious decisions about what deserves space in our lives and what doesn't. The relationships that drain us rather than fulfill us. The habits that hold us back rather than move us forward. The possessions that clutter our space rather than serve a purpose. Until we learn to sort, we'll never have the clarity we need to live intentionally." Emma sat there in silence for a moment, letting his words sink in. It was as if Walter had reached into her mind and pulled out a truth she'd been avoiding. Her life was cluttered. Not just her apartment, though that was certainly a mess, but her mental and emotional space too. For months now, maybe even years, Emma had been carrying around so much unnecessary weight. Toxic friendships she maintained out of obligation rather than genuine connection. Guilt over things that weren't even her fault. Self-doubt that whispered constantly in her ear, telling her she wasn't good enough, wasn't doing enough, wasn't enough. There was that friend from college, Jessica, who only called when she needed something, who spent every conversation complaining about her life but never asked how Emma was doing. There was the guilt Emma carried about her strained relationship with her mother, even though she'd tried everything to bridge that gap. There was the constant comparison she made between herself and other nurses, always finding herself lacking. All of it was like a heavy backpack she carried everywhere, weighing her down, making every step harder than it needed to be. That night, after her shift ended and she returned to her small studio apartment, Emma couldn't stop thinking about Walter's words. She sat on her bed, looking around at the physical clutter that surrounded her. Clothes draped over chairs, old magazines stacked in corners, papers scattered across her desk, dishes in the sink, forgotten coffee mugs on various surfaces. But more than the physical mess, she thought about the mental clutter, the emotional baggage she'd been dragging around for far too long. She grabbed a notebook from her desk, one she'd bought months ago with good intentions but had never used. Opening it to the first page, she drew a line down the middle. On the left side, she wrote essential. On the right side, non-essential. Then she started writing. Everything. Every relationship, every commitment, every habit, every thought pattern that consumed her mental energy. She wrote for almost an hour, filling several pages with brutal honesty. When she finished, she stared at what she'd created. On the essential side, there were her core relationships with people who genuinely cared about her work with patients, her health, her dreams of eventually traveling, which she'd put off for years, time for rest and self-care. On the non-essential side, the list was disturbingly long. Friendships that had become one-sided, social media scrolling that ate hours of her day without giving anything back. The guilt she carried about things outside her control. The habit of saying yes to every extra shift, even when she was already exhausted. The tendency to replay every mistake she'd ever made, keeping herself up at night with regret. Looking at these two columns, Emma felt something shift inside her. It was like someone had turned on a light in a room she'd been stumbling through in the dark. The next day, Emma began the sorting process, not all at once, which would have been overwhelming, but gradually, intentionally. She started with her social circle. Jessica, the friend who only took and never gave, Emma sent her a kind but honest message. She explained that she needed to focus on relationships that were mutually supportive, and she wished Jessica well. It felt scary hitting send, but afterwards, Emma felt lighter. She tackled her apartment next. All those clothes she never wore but kept just in case. The books she'd bought but would never read. The kitchen gadgets she'd purchased in moments of optimism but had never used. She filled 3 large boxes for donation and 2 bags for recycling. But the most important sorting happened internally. Emma started paying attention to her thoughts. When self-doubt crept in, she'd pause and ask herself, is this thought serving me? Is it true? Is it helping me grow? If the answer was no, she practiced letting it go, refusing to give it space in her mind. She quit checking Instagram every 5 minutes, that endless scroll of other people's highlight reels that always left her feeling inadequate. She deleted the app from her phone entirely. The first few days were hard, her thumb instinctively reaching for where the app used to be. But soon, she didn't miss it at all. Emma also started sorting her time. She'd been volunteering for every extra shift available, partly because she needed the money, but mostly because she felt guilty saying no. She realized this was burning her out, leaving her no time for the things that actually recharged her. She started saying no, protecting her days off like they were precious, because they were. During her lunch breaks at the hospital, Emma used to sit with a group of nurses who spent the entire time gossiping and complaining. She realized these conversations left her feeling more drained than before. So she started taking her breaks alone or with Sarah, another nurse who shared her love of mystery novels. These quieter, more positive interactions made a huge difference. One morning, Emma woke up and realized something remarkable. Her apartment felt spacious, peaceful even. She could actually breathe in her own space. But more importantly, her mind felt clearer. It was like she'd been living in a fog and it had finally lifted. The constant background noise of anxiety had quieted. She felt more present with her patients, more engaged with her work. The mechanical feeling that had taken over her job began to fade, replaced by that sense of purpose she remembered from her early days of nursing. About 2 weeks into her sorting journey, Emma was doing her evening rounds when she stopped by Walter's bed. He was sitting up, looking much stronger than when he'd first arrived. "You look different," he observed with a knowing smile. Emma grinned. "I took your advice about sorting, and Walter, it's been incredible. I feel like I can actually breathe again." Walter's eyes crinkled with warmth. "That's the first lesson, Emma. Until we sort through what we're carrying, we can't even see what truly matters. Everything's just buried under all the noise." "You were my first patient," Emma said softly, "who taught me that I needed therapy as much as I was trying to give care." "Sometimes," Walter replied, "the teacher appears exactly when the student is ready to learn." Their friendship had deepened into something special. It transcended the typical boundaries of the ICU. It was a connection between two people who recognized something in each other, a mutual understanding that life's most valuable lessons often come from unexpected places. Emma noticed changes beyond just feeling lighter. She was more patient with difficult family members of patients. She was more creative in solving problems at work. She had energy for hobbies she'd abandoned, like painting, which she hadn't touched since nursing school. She started actually listening to her patients, not just hearing their symptoms, but understanding their stories. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was a presence, someone who saw people in their full humanity. About 3 weeks after their first real conversation, Walter was discharged. His recovery had been remarkable, and he was finally well enough to go home. As Emma helped prepare his discharge papers, Walter handed her a small piece of paper, folded carefully. "Open it later," he said with a gentle smile. Emma tucked it into her pocket, feeling oddly emotional about saying goodbye to this patient who'd become so much more. That evening, in the quiet of her now organized apartment, Emma unfolded the paper. In careful handwriting it read, "If you want to keep your life clean and purposeful, learn to sort regularly. Sort your possessions. Sort your relationships. Sort your commitments. But most importantly, sort your emotions. Let go of what weighs you down. Keep only what helps you fly. This is not selfishness. This is self-preservation, and it's the foundation of everything else." Walter. Emma carefully placed the note in her journal, pressing it between the pages like a precious flower. She made herself a promise. Once a month, she would dedicate time to sorting. She would ask herself honestly, "Am I carrying only what serves my highest good?" Seiri, the art of sorting, wasn't just a one-time cleaning. It was a practice, a way of life. It was the conscious act of choosing what deserved space in her life and having the courage to release what didn't. If you're finding value in this content, consider subscribing to our channel or supporting us through our membership program. Your support helps us bring more content like this to you. Now, let's continue with the journey. We're all living in an invisible ICU of sorts. Sometimes our mind's monitor starts beeping. Sometimes our heart's battery runs low. And in those moments, clarity comes only when we pause and take inventory. When we look honestly at what we're carrying and ask ourselves, is this truly necessary? Or am I just surviving in the middle of clutter? Seiri, the practice of sorting, isn't just a cleaning technique. It's a journey of self-awareness. It teaches us that true peace is found not in having more, but in needing less. And when we remove the non-essential things, the essential things finally have room to shine. That's where real healing begins. Emma's transformation wasn't instantaneous. It was gradual, like watching the sun rise, almost imperceptible in each moment, but undeniable in its totality. She'd learned the first critical lesson, what to keep and what to release. But as the weeks passed, Emma started noticing something else. Having less clutter was wonderful, but there was still something missing. She'd cleared out the unnecessary, but now everything that remained needed a place, a proper place, a place where she could find it when she needed it, without stress, without searching, without that rising panic of, where did I put that? Emma's apartment was cleaner now, sure, but her bedside table still had a stack of books, not quite organized. Her work bag was stuffed with essentials, but finding her stethoscope always required digging. Her closet had fewer clothes, but they weren't arranged in any logical way, making getting dressed in the morning still more stressful than it needed to be. And beyond the physical space, there was her time, her energy, her mental bandwidth. She'd eliminated many drains on these resources, but the ones that remained were still scattered, unstructured, chaotic. One evening, about a month after Walter's discharge, Emma was restocking supplies in the ICU when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "They told me you'd be here." She turned to find Walter standing there, looking healthier than she'd ever seen him. He was there for a follow-up appointment and had asked at the desk where he might find her. "Walter!" Emma's face lit up. "You look amazing!" They talked for a few minutes, catching up. Emma told him about how she'd continued practicing Seiri, how much lighter she felt, how much clearer her mind had become. Walter listened with that attentive way of his, and then he said something that would set Emma on her next phase of growth. "I'm glad you've learned to sort, Emma. That's the foundation. But tell me, the things you've kept, do they all have their proper place?" And the thought about her apartment, about her workstation, about her daily routine. "Well," she admitted, "everything's there, but it's not exactly organized." Walter smiled knowingly. "That's your next lesson. Seiton, set in order. It's not enough to decide what stays. You have to give everything a specific home. Not just physical objects, but your time, your priorities, your energy. When everything has its place, life flows. When things are scattered, even good things, chaos still reigns." That night, Emma couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Walter's words. Her room was definitely better than it had been, but was it truly organized? Could she find what she needed quickly? Did everything have a logical place? The next morning was her day off. She decided to dedicate it to creating order, real order, in her space. She started by observing her own patterns. What did she use every single day? What did she use weekly? What did she use occasionally? What never got used at all, even though she'd kept it through her sorting process? Her stethoscope, her phone charger, her water bottle, her work shoes, a few key reference books. These were daily essentials. She needed them to be immediately accessible, no searching required. Her yoga mat, her painting supplies, her recipe books. These were weekly items. They deserved a designated space, but not prime real estate. Her seasonal clothes, her fancy dishes, her suitcase. These were occasional use items. They could go in less accessible storage. Emma started with her bedroom. She created zones, a morning routine zone by the door where her work bag, keys, and shoes lived, a bedside essentials zone where she kept her phone charger, current book, journal, and water bottle, a clothing zone in her closet, now organized not just by type, but by frequency of use. She bought a few simple organizers, nothing fancy or expensive, just clear bins and drawer dividers. She labeled everything: work clothes, workout gear, weekend casual. It felt almost silly being this specific, but the result was remarkable. Getting dressed in the morning went from a 15-minute scramble to a 3-minute process. Everything she needed was right where she expected it to be. She tackled her small kitchen next. Frequently used items, pots, pans, everyday dishes, cooking utensils, went in the cabinets closest to the stove. Coffee supplies went in a dedicated corner by the coffee maker. Rarely used appliances went in the harder-to-reach upper cabinets. The transformation was stunning. Cooking stopped feeling like a chore and started feeling creative again. She wasn't wasting energy searching for tools. Everything flowed. But Emma realized that Seiton wasn't just about physical organization. It was about organizing her entire life. She looked at her work schedule, which had been haphazard, accepting shifts randomly based on what was available and what felt urgent in the moment. She created a system. She designated certain days for work, certain days for rest, and certain days for personal projects. She blocked them out in her calendar, treating them with the same respect she'd treat any appointment. She organized her priorities, too. Before, everything felt equally urgent, equally important. But that was impossible. Some things truly mattered more than others. She created a hierarchy. Patient care came first. Her own health came second. Personal relationships, third. Professional development, fourth. Everything else fell below that. This didn't mean she neglected anything. It meant that when conflicts arose, she had a clear framework for making decisions. If staying late at work meant missing her yoga class, she'd check her priority system. Had she been neglecting her health lately? Then yoga won. Had she been fully taking care of herself, and this was a genuine patient emergency? Then work won. Having this structure removed so much decision fatigue. She wasn't making every choice from scratch every time. She had a system. Emma even organized her mental space. She designated time for worrying. This sounds strange, but it worked. Instead of letting anxious thoughts interrupt her throughout the day, she set aside 15 minutes every evening to think through any concerns. If worry popped up during the day, she'd make a note and tell herself, "I'll think about this during my designated time." Surprisingly, most of her worries seemed less important by the time her worry time came around. And the ones that were genuine got her full, focused attention instead of scattered, distracted anxiety. At the hospital, Emma started applying Seiton to her work processes. Her nursing cart had been functional, but not optimized. Now she reorganized it completely. Top drawer, most frequently used items: syringes, alcohol swabs, gauze, tape. Middle drawer, medications and supplies used several times per shift. Bottom drawer, rarely needed items. She color-coded everything. Red labels for emergency supplies, blue for routine care, green for comfort items like extra pillows and blankets. The change was immediate. She could grab what she needed without looking. In emergencies, those precious seconds she saved by not searching could mean the difference between life and death. Her colleagues started noticing. "Emma, your cart is so organized. Can you help me set up mine like that?" Soon, several nurses on her unit had adopted her system. The head nurse, Margaret, a stern woman in her 50s who rarely gave compliments, pulled Emma aside one day. "I've noticed a change in you, Torres. Your efficiency has improved significantly. Error rate is down. Patient satisfaction scores for your cases are up. What's your secret?" Emma smiled. "I learned to give everything a place. Not just things, but time, energy, priorities. When everything has a proper home, there's no chaos, just flow." Margaret nodded approvingly. "That's the mark of a mature nurse. Most people take years to figure that out." But Emma knew it wasn't just about nursing. It was about life. Seiton was teaching her that organization wasn't about being rigid or controlling. It was about creating systems that supported her, that made her life easier, that freed her mental energy for what truly mattered. She started setting boundaries in her relationships, too. Not in a harsh way, but in a clear way. She had specific times when she was available for social calls and times when she needed solitude. She communicated this to friends, and to her surprise, they respected it. The relationships that remained became deeper because when she was present, she was truly present. One particularly busy evening at the hospital, there was a multi-car accident. 5 critical patients arrived within 20 minutes. The ER was chaos. The ICU was chaos. Everyone was running on pure adrenaline. But Emma's station wasn't chaos. Because everything had its place, she could move quickly and efficiently. She knew exactly where every supply was. She didn't waste time thinking about what to do next because her training and her systems kicked in automatically. After the crisis passed and all 5 patients were stabilized, Margaret found Emma in the break room. "That was impressive work tonight. You were the calmest person in that unit." Emma shook her head. "I wasn't calm inside, but having systems helped. When everything has a place, you can function even when you're stressed." Margaret sat down beside her. "You know, I've been doing this job for 30 years, And I've learned that the best nurses aren't the ones with the most knowledge or even the most compassion, though those are important. The best nurses are the ones who can maintain order in chaos, who have systems they trust. You're becoming one of those nurses, Emma. That night, Emma updated her journal. She'd been keeping a weekly reflection practice, another system she'd implemented. She wrote, "Seiri taught me what to keep. Seiton is teaching me where to keep it and how to access it. I'm learning that organization isn't about perfection. It's about creating structures that support the life I want to live. When my physical space is organized, my mental space follows. When my schedule is organized, my energy follows. When my priorities are organized, my decisions follow. Everything flows from having a proper place for everything." About 6 weeks into her Seiton practice, Emma noticed something remarkable. She had more free time. This seemed paradoxical. She wasn't working less, but because she wasn't wasting time searching for things, deciding what to do next, or recovering from chaos, she had hours that simply appeared. She used this time to reconnect with painting, something she'd loved in college but had abandoned. Every Sunday morning became her art time. She set up a small corner of her apartment as a mini studio. Paint, brushes, canvases, all organized and ready. When Sunday came, she didn't have to prepare or set up. She just sat down and created. This brought a joy back into her life that had been missing for years, and it was possible only because she'd created the structure to support it. Emma also started mentoring newer nurses. She'd share her organization systems, but more than that, she'd share the philosophy behind them. "It's not about being type A or controlling," she'd explain. "It's about respecting your own time and energy. When you organize your external world, you create space for your internal world to thrive." One of the new nurses, Bethany, a young woman fresh out of nursing school and completely overwhelmed, started following Emma's methods. A month later, Bethany told Emma, "I was ready to quit. I couldn't handle the stress. But your systems, they made everything manageable. I actually love this job now." Emma realized that Seiton wasn't just changing her life. Through her example, it was creating ripples that affected others. Organization was contagious. Walter came by for another checkup about 2 months after Emma had started practicing Seiton. When he saw her, he immediately smiled. "You found your places, didn't you?" Emma laughed. "Is it that obvious?" "You carry yourself differently, more grounded, less scattered." He paused, then added, "But there's a third step, Emma, one that's often overlooked. It's called Seiso, and it's about maintenance, about care, about daily attention to what you've created." Emma pulled out her phone and made a note. "Tell me more." But Walter shook his head with a gentle smile. "You'll discover it when you're ready. But here's a hint. It's not enough to organize once. Life is always moving, always changing. The question is, how do you maintain what you've built?" Chapter 2. The Practice of Daily Attention. Emma's life had taken on a rhythm that felt almost foreign to her after years of chaos. She'd sorted through what mattered and what didn't. She'd given everything a proper place. Her apartment was organized. Her workstation was efficient. Her schedule made sense. For the first time in years, she felt like she had control over her life. But Walter's words echoed in her mind. How do you maintain what you've built? It was a question she'd been unconsciously avoiding, because she knew, deep down, that creating order was one thing. Keeping it was something else entirely. About 3 months into her organizational journey, Emma started noticing small signs of decay. Not catastrophic collapse, just little things. A few papers had accumulated on her previously clear desk. Her work cart, while still mostly organized, had a few items that had migrated to the wrong drawers. Her morning routine, once smooth and effortless, had developed a few hiccups because she'd gotten lazy about putting things back where they belonged. It was a Sunday morning, her designated painting day, and Emma was annoyed to discover that she'd have to spend the first 15 minutes cleaning up her art corner before she could actually paint. Brushes that should have been cleaned and stored were still crusty with dried paint. Her palette was a mess. Tubes of paint were scattered instead of organized by color. She'd let maintenance slide, and now she was paying for it with her precious creative time. That same week at the hospital, there was a staff meeting about facility maintenance. The hospital administration had initiated what they called a deep clean week. Every department was responsible for thoroughly cleaning and organizing their areas. Emma expected groaning from her colleagues. Cleaning wasn't exactly why people went into nursing. But to her surprise, Margaret, the head nurse, framed it differently. This isn't about making the hospital look pretty, Margaret said firmly. This is about respect. Respect for our workspace, respect for our patients, and respect for ourselves. When we maintain our environment with care, we're saying that this work matters, that we matter. The words hit Emma hard. Maintenance wasn't just a chore, it was an act of care. During the Deep Clean initiative, Emma really looked at her workstation for the first time in weeks. Really looked. The cart she'd so carefully organized had collected dust in the corners. Some of the labels she'd made were peeling. The drawer handles were sticky from repeated use without wiping. There were small stains on the surfaces that had become invisible through familiarity. She put on gloves, got cleaning supplies, and went to work. Not just surface cleaning, but deep, attentive cleaning. She removed every item from her cart, cleaned each one individually, wiped down every surface, checked every label, reorganized anything that had gotten out of place. It took almost 2 hours. 2 hours she could have spent doing more important things. But as she worked, something unexpected happened. She felt a sense of pride, of ownership, of connection to her workspace that had been missing. When she finished, her cart didn't just look clean, it gleamed. And using it felt different. It felt like she was using a tool she respected in a space she cared about. One of the other nurses, David, a middle-aged man who'd been working at the hospital for 15 years, walked by and stopped. "Wow, Torres, that's impressive. You didn't have to go that deep." Emma looked up and smiled. "I know, but I wanted to. This is where I spend most of my waking hours. It deserves attention." David nodded slowly, then looked at his own cart, which was functional but neglected. "You're making the rest of us look bad," he joked, but there was something thoughtful in his expression. That evening, Emma went home and applied the same principle to her apartment. She didn't just tidy up. She cleaned with attention, with care. She noticed things she'd been overlooking. The buildup of dust on her bookshelf, the grime in the corners of her bathroom, the fingerprints on her light switches, the way her organized desk drawers had accumulated little bits of paper debris. As she cleaned, she thought about Walter's words. Maintenance. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't exciting, but it was essential. She realized something profound. Seiso wasn't just about physical cleaning. It was about paying attention, about noticing the small deteriorations before they became big problems, about caring enough to maintain what you've created. Emma started thinking about how this applied beyond physical spaces. What about her relationships? Had she been maintaining those? She'd sorted out the toxic ones and kept the healthy ones, sure. But was she actively caring for the good relationships she had? There was her friend Maria, someone she genuinely cared about. But Emma realized she'd been letting that friendship drift through neglect. Not intentional neglect, just the passive kind that happens when you stop making effort. When was the last time she'd reached out just to check in? Not because she needed something. Emma picked up her phone and called Maria. Not texted, called. When Maria answered, surprised to hear her voice, Emma simply said, "Hey, I was thinking about you. How are you really doing?" They talked for an hour. Afterwards, Emma felt the warmth of connection she'd been missing. Maintenance. It applied to relationships, too. What about her health? She'd created good systems, organized workout times, meal planning. But had she been maintaining those systems? Actually following through? She had to admit that over the past few weeks, she'd skipped several workouts. Told herself she'd get back on track, but hadn't actually done it. Seiso was teaching her that good intentions weren't enough. You had to actively maintain the positive changes you made. Daily attention, daily care. Emma created a new system for herself. Every evening, she'd spend 10 minutes doing what she started calling her shine time. It wasn't a huge time commitment, but it was consistent. During her shine time, she'd do a quick sweep of her apartment. Not deep cleaning every day, but maintaining. Putting things back where they belonged. Wiping down surfaces. Clearing off her desk. Doing dishes before they piled up. She also did an internal check-in. How was she feeling emotionally? Were there any small resentments or frustrations building up that needed to be addressed before they became bigger issues? Any self-care she'd been neglecting? At work, Emma implemented a similar practice. At the end of every shift before clocking out, she'd take 5 minutes to reset her workstation, restock supplies, wipe down surfaces, make sure everything was in its proper place, ready for the next shift. Other nurses started noticing. Her station was always immaculate, always. Ready, never chaotic. Margaret pulled her aside one day. "Emma, I want you to present at our next staff meeting about your systems, about maintenance. I think the whole unit could benefit." Emma was nervous about presenting, but she prepared carefully. She didn't just talk about cleaning. She talked about the philosophy of Seiso, about paying attention, about daily care preventing larger problems. about respect for yourself and your work. She shared a story that Walter had told her during one of his visits. When he was young, just starting his architecture career, he'd worked under a master architect from Japan. Every morning, this architect would arrive early and clean his drafting table, his tools, his entire workspace. Not because it was dirty, but as a ritual, as a way of preparing his mind for the day's work. He told me, Emma explained to her colleagues, that cleaning his space was like cleaning his mind, starting fresh, paying attention to details, respecting the tools of his craft. I think we can apply that same principle here. She saw several nurses nodding. Even the skeptical ones seemed interested. Emma created a simple checklist for the unit. Nothing burdensome, just a 5-minute end-of-shift routine. Restock, wipe down, reset, check equipment. The next shift always started with a clean slate. Within 2 weeks, the difference was noticeable. The ICU ran more smoothly. There were fewer moments of, "Where did I put that?" or "Who left this out?" The energy in the unit shifted from reactive to proactive. But the most profound change was internal. Emma noticed that when she maintained her external environment with care, her internal state reflected that care. She felt more grounded, more present, more appreciative of what she had. One night, there was a new admission. A teenage boy named Marcus had been in a car accident. He was going to be okay, but he was scared, and his mother was absolutely terrified. Emma could have just done her job, mechanically. Check vitals, start IV, input data. But the practice of Seiso had taught her something about attention, about care in the details. She took extra time to make sure Marcus's area was clean and comfortable. She arranged the monitoring wires neatly so they wouldn't tangle. She adjusted his pillow. She explained every beep and alarm so he wouldn't be scared. She brought his mother a chair and a warm blanket. Small things, details, but they mattered. Marcus's mother grabbed Emma's hand. "Thank you. Thank you for treating him like he's precious." Emma felt tears prick her eyes. He is precious. Every patient is. After they'd settled, Emma stepped into the hallway and took a breath. This was why she'd become a nurse. Not just to dispense medications and follow protocols, but to care, truly care. And Seiso was teaching her that care lived in the details, in the daily attention, in the small acts of maintenance that most people overlooked. She thought about how different she'd been just a few months ago, burned out, going through the motions, disconnected. The journey through Seiri, Seiton, and now Seiso was bringing her back to herself, back to purpose. Emma started noticing areas of neglect in other parts of her life. Her car, for instance. It had become a mobile trash can. Old coffee cups, receipts, random papers, workout clothes. She'd been so focused on organizing her apartment and workspace that she'd completely ignored her car. On her next day off, she spent an hour giving her car the Seiso treatment. Deep cleaning, organizing, creating designated spots for necessary items like her insurance papers and emergency kit. When she finished, driving felt different, more pleasant, more respectful of herself. She applied the same principle to her digital life. Her email inbox had 3,847 unread messages. Her computer desktop was cluttered with random files. Her phone had apps she never used, taking up space and attention. she dedicated an afternoon to digital. Seiso. Unsubscribed from marketing emails. Organized her inbox with folders. Cleaned up her desktop. Deleted unused apps. Set up systems to maintain this organization going forward. The mental clarity that came from this digital cleaning was remarkable. Every time she opened her laptop or phone, instead of feeling overwhelmed, she felt in control. Emma realized that Seiso was about breaking the cycle of neglect. It's easy to organize once, full of enthusiasm and motivation, but maintaining that organization? That requires discipline. That requires turning maintenance into a habit, a practice, something you do not because you feel like it, but because you've committed to it. She created what she called her weekly shine checklist. Every Sunday evening, she'd go through it. Deep clean one area of apartment, rotating through rooms. Review and organize digital spaces. Check in on important relationships. Call or message someone. Review personal goals and adjust if needed. Prepare workspace for the week ahead. Do a mental check-in. Journal about emotional state. This hour-long weekly practice kept everything she'd built from deteriorating. It wasn't exciting, it wasn't glamorous, but it was powerful. One evening, about 4 months into her transformation journey, Walter came by the hospital again. Emma was surprised to see him, as he'd been doing well and didn't have an appointment scheduled. "I was in the neighborhood," he said with a smile that suggested otherwise. "Thought I'd see how you're doing." They sat in the family waiting area, and Emma told him about her Seiso practice, about daily maintenance, about attention to details, about how caring for her environment had taught her to care for herself. Walter listened with that deep attention of his, and when she finished, he nodded slowly. "You've learned something most people never figure out. That discipline isn't about big, dramatic changes. It's about small, consistent actions. It's about showing up every day, even when it's not exciting." "But Walter," Emma admitted, "sometimes I worry that it's all too much. All these systems, all this maintenance. What if I can't keep it up?" Walter's expression grew serious. "That's your next challenge, Emma. Creating systems that are sustainable. That's Seiketsu. It's not enough to sort, organize, and clean if you can't maintain it long term. You need to standardize, to create routines and structures that don't require constant willpower." Emma pulled out her notebook, always ready to learn. "Think about it," Walter continued. "Right now, you're maintaining everything through conscious effort. That's good. That's necessary at first. But eventually, it needs to become automatic. Like brushing your teeth. You don't need motivation to brush your teeth. You just do it because it's a standardized part of your routine." Emma thought about this. He was right. Her current systems required her to remember, to think, to choose every day. What if she could make them so automatic that they didn't require decision-making? "How do I do that?" she asked. Walter smiled. "You're already starting to. Those checklists you make, those are standardization tools. But you need to go deeper. Create systems that support systems. Build habits on top of habits. Make the easy choice the right choice." Before he left, Walter handed her another note. just like he had when he was discharged. Read this when you're ready to take the next step. Emma tucked it into her pocket, but she already felt the pull toward understanding this next level. Seiso had taught her about daily care and attention, but how could she make that sustainable for the long term? How could she build systems that would last not just for months, but for years, for a lifetime? That night, Emma looked around her apartment. It was clean, organized, maintained. Her work life was structured and efficient. Her relationships were healthier. Her mental space was clearer. But she knew Walter was right. This was still requiring significant effort. If she wanted this to be permanent, she needed to move from consciously maintaining to unconsciously sustaining. She thought about the nurses at the hospital who'd been initially enthusiastic about the new cleaning protocols. After a few weeks, some of them had started slipping. Not because they didn't care, but because maintaining enthusiasm is exhausting. They needed systems that didn't rely on enthusiasm. Emma opened her journal and wrote, "Seiso has taught me that care lives in the details, that daily attention prevents major problems, that maintenance is an act of self-respect, but I can feel the effort it requires. The next step is making this effortless. Not because I don't care, but because I've built structures that make caring the path of least resistance." She thought about areas where this was already happening. Brushing her teeth, like Walter mentioned. She didn't need motivation for that. It was just what you do before bed and after waking. It was standardized, automatic, non-negotiable. What if she could make her organization and maintenance practices just as automatic? She started thinking about her environment. Right now, maintaining her organized apartment required remembering to put things away. What if she designed her space so that putting things away was easier than leaving them out? She started experimenting. She put a small dish by the door for her keys and wallet. Now, instead of having to remember to hang them on a hook or put them in a drawer, she could just drop them in the dish. Easier, and it kept them from getting lost. She put a small trash can in every room where she tended to accumulate trash. In her bedroom, by her nightstand. In her bathroom. In her small living area. Now, instead of trash accumulating because throwing it away required going to another room, disposal was always within reach. She bought a charging station for all her devices and put it in one dedicated spot. No more random chargers in random places. Everything charged in one location, ready to grab. These were small changes, but they made maintenance effortless. She wasn't relying on willpower or memory. She was designing her environment to support her goals. At work, Emma started thinking about how to standardize the cleaning and organization protocols so they didn't rely on individual motivation. She created color-coded labels that were laminated and permanent. She created pictorial guides showing exactly where each item should be stored. She created quick reference cards that could be clipped to each cart. Now, even on a chaotic shift, even when tired, everyone knew exactly where things went. There was no decision-making required. The system itself guided the behavior. She also created what she called shift transition protocols, a 5-minute structured handoff between shifts that included not just patient information, but a quick check of supplies and workspace organization. This built maintenance directly into the workflow. It wasn't an extra task, it was just part of transitioning shifts. Margaret was impressed. "You're thinking like a leader, Emma. You're not just following good practices, you're creating systems that help others follow them too." Emma was learning that standardization wasn't about being rigid or controlling. It was about making the right choices the easy choices, about building environments and routines that naturally supported the outcomes you wanted. She thought about fitness. For years, she'd struggled with consistent exercise. She'd have bursts of motivation, go to the gym for a few weeks, then fall off. The problem wasn't that she didn't know exercise was important. The problem was that every workout required a series of decisions and obstacles. Decision fatigue was real. Every choice we make depletes our willpower slightly. By the end of a long day at the hospital, Emma had no decision-making energy left. So she started removing decisions. She laid out her workout clothes the night before. She packed her gym bag and put it by the door. She scheduled her workouts at the same time every week, making them non-negotiable appointments. She created a simple rotation of workouts so she never had to think about what to do at the gym. The result? Her workout consistency went from maybe 30% to about 85%. And it felt easier, not harder, because she'd removed the friction. She applied this principle to everything. Meal planning became standardized. Every Sunday, she'd plan meals for the week, shop once, and prep what she could in advance. During the week, cooking was simple because the decisions had already been made and the prep was done. Her morning routine became a checklist she didn't even need to look at anymore because it was the same every day. Wake up, bathroom routine, make bed, 10-minute meditation, prepare coffee, check schedule, get dressed. Same order every time, no decisions required. This freed up mental energy for things that actually required thought and creativity. Her work, her relationships, her art, her growth. Emma noticed that as she standardized her routines, she had more emotional stability. When life was chaotic and unpredictable, she felt anxious. But when she had reliable routines and systems, she felt grounded. Even when external circumstances were stressful, her internal world remained relatively calm because she had structures to fall back on. One particularly difficult shift illustrated this perfectly. There was a patient who was declining rapidly, and despite everyone's best efforts, he passed away. It was Emma's first death in several months, and it hit hard. She felt the old familiar wave of emotional exhaustion. But instead of spiraling, she had systems to support her. She knew she had a therapy session scheduled for the next morning, something she'd standardized into her monthly routine. She knew she'd go home to an organized, peaceful space. She knew she'd follow her evening routine, which included journaling, a practice that helped her process difficult emotions. These weren't luxuries she had to think about arranging. They were built into her life, standardized, ready for exactly these moments. The death still hurt, but she didn't feel like she was drowning. She had structures that held her when she felt like falling apart. David, the nurse who'd commented on her clean cart weeks ago, approached her after that shift. "That was rough today. You okay?" Emma nodded. "Yeah, it's hard, but I'll be okay. I have systems in place for processing this stuff." David looked curious. Systems for grief? Kind of, Emma explained. I can't control what happens at work, but I can control how I take care of myself afterwards. I have routines that help me stay stable even when things are unstable. David was quiet for a moment. You know what? I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I never thought about it that way. I just react to whatever happens. No wonder I'm constantly stressed. Emma realized that what she'd learned over the past few months wasn't just personal. It was something that could help others. The 5S system, Seiri, Seiton, Seiso, Seiketsu. It wasn't just about organization. It was about creating a life structure that supported well-being, resilience, and growth. She'd started by sorting out what mattered. Then she'd organized everything into its proper place. Then she'd learned to maintain what she'd created through daily attention. Now she was learning to standardize those practices so they were sustainable. But there was still one more step, one more S, and Emma was beginning to understand what it might be. Walter's note was still in her journal. She hadn't looked at it since he gave it to her. That evening, after processing the difficult day, she opened it. In Walter's careful handwriting, it read, "The last step is the hardest, Emma. It's called Shitsuke, self-discipline. It's about doing these things not because you have systems that make them easy, but because you've become someone who does them. It's about identity, about becoming, not just doing. When you reach that point, discipline stops being something you practice and becomes who you are." Emma read the note 3 times. Becoming, not just doing. Identity, not just behavior. She thought about where she'd started, a burned-out nurse who couldn't keep her life together. And now, she was someone different, someone who valued order, who maintained her space with care, who showed up consistently even when it was hard. But was this who she was? Or was this still something she was doing? The question felt important. Life-changing, even. Chapter 3. Becoming the Discipline. Emma stood in her apartment on a quiet Tuesday evening, looking at the systems she'd built over the past 5 months. Everything had a place. Everything was maintained. Her routines ran like clockwork. But Walter's question lingered in her mind like a persistent melody. Had she become someone who lived this way? Or was she still just someone doing these things? The distinction seemed subtle at first, but the more Emma thought about it, the more profound it became. Doing something requires effort, willpower, constant decision-making. Being someone, that's different. That's identity. And identity doesn't require motivation, it just is. She thought about people who say, "I'm a runner." They don't have to motivate themselves to run. Running is part of who they are. When they don't run, they feel off, like something's missing. The behavior has become inseparable from identity. Emma wanted that. She wanted organization and discipline to be so deeply integrated into who she was that maintaining them felt as natural as breathing. But she also knew she wasn't there yet. Not completely. Because there were still days when following her systems felt like work. Days when she had to push herself to do her evening reset. Days when she resented the structure instead of being grateful for it. The next morning at the hospital, Emma arrived to find the ICU in a state of controlled chaos. There had been a multi-vehicle collision on the highway during the early morning hours. 4 critical patients had arrived almost simultaneously, and the night shift was still dealing with the aftermath. Emma could see the stress on everyone's faces. Carts were disorganized from the emergency. Supplies were scattered. The carefully maintained systems had been temporarily abandoned in the urgency of saving lives, which was absolutely the right priority. But now, with the immediate crisis stabilized, everyone was working in the disorder, and Emma could see it, affecting efficiency. Nurses were searching for supplies. There was confusion about which medications had been used and needed restocking. The stress that should have been dissipating was instead being maintained by the chaotic environment. Without being asked, Emma began quietly restoring order, not in a way that interfered with patient care, but systematically. She restocked her own cart first, then started helping others. She reorganized the supply closet that had been raided during the emergency. She cleaned and reset the crash cart. Margaret, who'd been on duty through the whole incident, noticed. "Emma, you don't have to do all that. It's not your mess." Emma looked up and smiled. "I know, but it helps everyone, right? And honestly, I can't function well in disorder anymore. This isn't me being helpful, it's me creating the environment I need." Margaret studied her for a moment, then said something that would stick with Emma forever. "That's the mark of someone who's internalized discipline. You're not following rules, you're expressing who you are." The words hit Emma like a revelation. She wasn't cleaning because she should. She was cleaning because disorder felt wrong to her now. The behavior had become part of her identity. Later that week, Emma had lunch with her friend Maria, the one she'd reconnected with months ago. They were sitting in a small cafe when Maria said, "Can I ask you something? What happened to you?" Emma was surprised. "What do you mean?" "You're different," Maria said, not unkindly. "More, I don't know, settled, present. 5 months ago, you were a mess. I mean, I love you, but you were scattered, stressed, always running late, always forgetting things. Now you're like this calm, organized person. How did that happen?" Emma had to think about how to explain. She started telling Maria about Walter, about the 5S system, about her journey through sorting, organizing, cleaning, and standardizing. But Maria interrupted. "Okay, but lots of people try to get organized. Most of them fail or slip back into old patterns. Why did it stick for you?" That was the question, wasn't it? Why had this transformation been different from all the other times Emma had tried to change? "I think," Emma said slowly, working it out as she spoke, "it's because I didn't just change what I did. I changed how I saw myself. I stopped being someone who wants to be organized and became someone who is organized. Does that make sense?" Maria nodded thoughtfully. "Like how I stopped saying, 'I'm trying to be vegetarian,' and started saying, 'I am vegetarian.' Once I made that identity shift, it became easy. I wasn't resisting meat. I just wasn't someone who ate meat anymore." "Exactly," Emma felt excited. "That's Seiketsu and Shitsuke. It's about making the practices so consistent, so standardized, that they become part of your identity. They become who you are, not what you do. Over the next few weeks, Emma became fascinated with this concept of identity-based change. She started reading about it, researching the psychology behind habit formation and identity shift. She learned that most people try to change from the outside in. They set goals, create plans, force behaviors. But lasting change happens from the inside out. You decide who you want to be, and then you take actions consistent with that identity. Emma started applying this consciously. Instead of saying, "I need to exercise," she started saying, "I'm an active person." Instead of, "I should eat healthy," she said, "I'm someone who nourishes my body well." Instead of, "I need to be more organized," she said, "I'm an organized person." These weren't just semantic changes. They were fundamental shifts in self-concept. And they changed everything. When Emma thought of herself as trying to be organized, maintaining her systems felt like work, like something she had to force herself to do. But when she thought of herself as someone who is organized, maintaining systems felt natural. Not doing it would feel wrong, inconsistent with who she was. She noticed this playing out in small moments. One evening, she came home exhausted from an especially long shift. In the past, she would have dropped her bag, kicked off her shoes wherever, and collapsed on the couch, telling herself she'd clean up later. But that evening, even in her exhaustion, she found herself automatically hanging up her coat, putting her shoes in their designated spot, placing her bag where it belonged. Not because she forced herself to, but because leaving things scattered felt uncomfortable. It conflicted with her identity as an organized person. The behavior had become automatic, not through willpower, but through identity integration. Emma started helping other nurses at the hospital understand this principle. When Bethany, the young nurse she'd been mentoring, complained about struggling to maintain the organizational systems, Emma asked her a different question than usual. "Who do you think you are?" Emma asked. Bethany looked confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean, when you think about yourself, how do you describe yourself? Are you someone who's organized, or someone who's trying to be organized?" Bethany thought about it. "Trying to be, I guess. I'm naturally kind of messy." "There's your problem," Emma said gently. "You're maintaining an identity as a messy person while trying to do organized behaviors. That's exhausting, because you're constantly fighting against yourself." "So what do I do?" Start seeing yourself differently. You're not a messy person trying to be organized. You're an organized person who's still developing that part of yourself. Every time you put something in its place, you're not fighting your nature. You're expressing your nature. Bethany looked skeptical, but over the next few weeks, Emma watched her slowly shift. She started making comments like, "That's not where that goes," instead of, "I should probably put that away." Small linguistic shifts that reflected growing identity changes. The transformation was remarkable. Within a month, Bethany's workstation was consistently organized. Not because she was forcing herself, but because disorder had started to bother her. The identity was taking root. Emma realized she was witnessing the power of Shitsuke, the final S. Self-discipline, not as willpower, but as self-expression. Doing what's right, not because you should, but because it's who you are. About 6 months into her journey, Emma faced her biggest test. Her mother, with whom she had a complicated relationship, needed surgery and asked Emma to come home for 2 weeks to help with recovery. Emma agreed, but she was nervous. Her childhood home was the opposite of organized. Her mother was a kind woman, but a chaotic one. The house was always cluttered, meals were irregular, routines were non-existent. Emma worried that 2 weeks in that environment would undo all the progress she'd made. The first day back home confirmed her fears. The house was messier than she remembered. Dishes piled in the sink, mail and papers covered every surface. Her old bedroom, which she'd be staying in, was being used as storage and was filled with boxes and random items. In the past, Emma would have either become anxious and controlling, trying to force organization on everyone, or she would have given up entirely and slipped back into chaos herself. But now, she did neither. Instead, she quietly created order in her own space without imposing on anyone else. She cleared out her room, organized her temporary living area, maintained her personal routines. She helped her mother when asked, but she didn't try to fix everything. And remarkably, her identity as an organized person remained intact. Because it wasn't dependent on external circumstances anymore, it was internal. She was organized even in a chaotic environment because organization was who she was, not just what her apartment looked like. Her mother noticed. "You're different, Emma, more peaceful. You used to get so stressed when things were messy." "I still prefer order," Emma admitted, "but I'm learning that my internal state doesn't have to match external chaos. I can be calm and organized inside, even when things around me aren't." By the end of the 2 weeks, Emma's mother's recovery was going well. And, interestingly, the house was a bit more organized, too. Not because Emma had nagged or forced it, but because her mother had been influenced by Emma's example. She'd watched Emma maintain simple routines and systems, even in a chaotic environment, and it had inspired her to try a few small changes herself. When Emma returned to her own apartment and her job at the hospital, she felt a deep sense of confidence. The test had proven something important. Her transformation was real. It wasn't dependent on perfect circumstances. It was part of who she'd become. At work, Emma's influence continued to spread. The ICU had become noticeably more efficient, more organized, more calm. Other departments in the hospital started asking about their protocols. Emma was invited to present at a hospital-wide training on organizational systems in healthcare. She was nervous about presenting to such a large group, but she prepared carefully. And she decided to tell the whole story, from her burnout to her transformation, from Walter's teachings to her journey through the 5S principles. The presentation was scheduled for a Friday afternoon in the hospital's main conference room. Emma expected maybe 30 or 40 people. Instead, over 100 healthcare workers showed up, from nurses to doctors to administrative staff. Emma took a deep breath and began. 6 months ago, I was drowning. I loved my job, but I was burning out. My life felt chaotic, my mind felt scattered, and I couldn't see a way forward. Then I met a patient who taught me 5 principles that changed everything. She walked them through Seiri, Seiton, Seiso, Seiketsu, and Shitsuke. But she didn't just explain the concepts, she shared her story. The vulnerability, the struggles, the breakthroughs. She showed before and after photos of her work cart. She demonstrated the systems she'd created. She talked honestly about the challenges of maintaining discipline. But most importantly, she talked about identity. The real transformation, she said, doesn't happen when you create systems. It happens when you become the kind of person who naturally maintains those systems. When discipline stops being something you do and becomes who you are. The room was silent. You could feel the resonance, people recognizing themselves in her story. After the presentation, at least 20 people came up to talk to her. They shared their own struggles with burnout, with chaos, with wanting to change but not knowing how. Emma gave each person her time, her attention, her encouragement. Margaret pulled her aside afterwards. "That was remarkable, Emma. You didn't just teach them techniques, you gave them hope. You showed them transformation is possible." Emma felt tears welling up. "I just shared what Walter taught me, what this journey taught me." "No," Margaret said firmly. "Walter planted seeds, but you did the work. You made the changes. You became living proof that these principles work. That's powerful." That evening, Emma sat in her organized apartment and reflected on how far she'd come. 6 months ago, she'd been lost. Now she had clarity, structure, purpose, peace. But she also knew that this wasn't the end. Shitsuke, the final S, wasn't a destination. It was a practice, a commitment to continuous growth and improvement, to never becoming complacent, always pushing to be better. She thought about Walter's note. When you reach that point, discipline stops being something you practice and becomes who you are. She wasn't fully there yet, but she was closer, much closer, and she could see the path forward clearly. Emma pulled out her journal and wrote, "I'm learning that discipline isn't about perfection, it's about consistency. It's not about never failing, it's about always returning. It's not about controlling everything, it's about controlling what matters, yourself, your response, your choices. Seiri taught me to let go, Seiton taught me to organize, Seiso taught me to maintain, Seiketsu taught me to standardize, and Shitsuke is teaching me to become, to transform discipline from a practice into an identity. I'm not someone who tries to be organized. I am organized. I'm not someone who wants to be disciplined. I am disciplined. Not perfectly, not always easily, but truly, deeply, as part of who I am." The next day at work, there was a surprise. Walter walked into the ICU not as a patient, but as a visitor. He was looking healthy, vibrant even. He'd brought coffee and asked if Emma had a few minutes to talk. They sat in the family waiting area, and Walter asked about her journey. Emma told him everything. About the struggles and victories, about the presentation, about the identity shift she'd experienced. Walter listened with that deep attention she'd come to treasure. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. "You've done it, Emma. You've completed the journey. Not because you're perfect, but because you've integrated these principles into who you are." "I couldn't have done it without you," Emma said. "You started all of this." Walter shook his head. "I gave you information. You did the transformation. There's a big difference." He paused, then continued. "Can I tell you why I shared these principles with you?" Emma nodded, curious. She'd always wondered why Walter had taken such an interest in her. "My wife, Maria, the one I told you about, she was a nurse," Walter began. "Worked in this very hospital, actually, though that was 30 years ago. She was brilliant at her job, compassionate, dedicated, but she burned herself out. She gave everything to everyone else and nothing to herself. She never learned to sort what mattered from what didn't, never created systems to protect her energy." Walter's eyes glistened slightly. "She died young, Emma. Stress-related heart attack at 52. I've always wondered if she'd still be here if someone had taught her these principles. If she'd learned to create boundaries, to organize her life, to maintain her well-being along with caring for others." Emma felt tears streaming down her face. "Walter, I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry," Walter said gently. "Just promise me you'll keep teaching this. Keep showing other healthcare workers that they can be excellent at their jobs and still take care of themselves. That discipline isn't about sacrifice, it's about sustainability." "I promise," Emma said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. Walter stood to leave, but before he did, he said one more thing. "The 5S principles, they're not just for work or organization, Emma. They're a philosophy for life. Sort what matters, organize it well, maintain it daily, standardize your practices, and become someone who lives these principles naturally. Do that, and you'll never lose yourself, no matter how demanding life gets." After Walter left, Emma sat for a while, processing everything. She thought about Maria, about Walter's loss, about why he'd invested so much in teaching her. The 5S principles weren't just organizational tools. They were a gift passed from someone who'd lost a person he loved to someone who still had time to change her trajectory. Emma made a decision. She would honor that gift. She would continue developing these principles in her own life, but she'd also share them widely. She'd mentor new nurses. She'd continue presenting. She'd write about her journey. She'd make sure that Walter's wisdom and Maria's memory created ripples that spread far beyond this hospital. Over the next few months, Emma's life continued to evolve. She started a blog about sustainable healthcare practice, sharing the 5S principles and her journey. It grew slowly at first, then rapidly, as healthcare workers across the country resonated with her message. She created a mentorship program at the hospital for new nurses, with 5S principles at its core. Burnout rates in her unit decreased significantly. Job satisfaction increased. Patient outcomes improved because the staff were healthier and more focused. Emma also noticed that as she continued practicing Shitsuke, sustaining discipline through identity, other areas of her life naturally improved. Her relationships deepened because she was more present. Her creativity flourished because she had mental space for it. Her health improved because self-care was no longer an afterthought, but a natural expression of who she was. She wasn't perfect. There were still difficult days, still moments when she struggled, still times when she slipped back into old patterns. But now she had the tools and the identity to recover quickly. She didn't see setbacks as failures, but as data points, information about what needed adjustment. 1 year after that first conversation with Walter, Emma was invited to speak at a national nursing conference. The topic, Sustainable Excellence, How the 5S Principles Can Transform Healthcare and Healthcare Workers. Standing on that stage, looking out at hundreds of nurses, Emma felt a profound sense of gratitude. Gratitude for Walter's teachings. Gratitude for her own commitment to change. Gratitude for every small step that had led to this moment. She began her speech with a simple statement. A year ago, I was a good nurse having a breakdown. Today, I'm a better nurse having a breakthrough. The difference wasn't in my skills or knowledge. It was in understanding 5 simple principles that taught me how to sort my life, organize my priorities, maintain my well-being, standardize my practices, and ultimately become someone who lives with discipline, not as a burden, but as an expression of who I am. The audience was captivated. After the speech, Emma was surrounded by nurses wanting to learn more, sharing their own struggles with burnout and chaos, asking for guidance. She gave them what Walter had given her, not just information, but hope. The hope that transformation is possible, that you don't have to choose between excellence and well-being, that discipline, properly understood, isn't restrictive, but liberating. That evening, in her hotel room, Emma video called Walter to tell him about the conference. He was delighted, but not surprised. You were always going to find your way here, Emma. You just needed someone to show you the path. It's not just about me anymore, Emma said. This is becoming something bigger. People are hungry for these teachings. Walter nodded. That's because people are drowning in complexity and chaos. The 5S principles offer simplicity without being simplistic, structure without being rigid. They work because they're based on fundamental truths about how humans function best. After they hung up, Emma looked around her organized hotel room. Even traveling, she maintained her practices. Her clothes were organized. Her morning routine was intact. Her evening reflection continued, not because she forced herself, but because these practices were now as natural to her as breathing. She thought about the journey, from chaos to order, from reaction to intention, from trying to be disciplined to being disciplined. The 5 S's had given her more than organizational skills. They'd given her a framework for living, a philosophy that touched every aspect of her existence. Seiri, sorting, had taught her discernment, the ability to distinguish essential from non-essential, to let go of what didn't serve her, to create space for what mattered. Seiton, setting in order, had taught her intentionality, the practice of giving everything its proper place, of organizing life in ways that supported her goals rather than hindered them. Seiso, shining, had taught her attention, the discipline of daily maintenance, of caring for her environment and herself with consistent loving attention. Seiketsu, standardizing, had taught her sustainability, the creation of systems and routines that made right actions easier than wrong ones, that built habits on top of habits until excellence became automatic. And Shitsuke, self-discipline, was teaching her integration, the deep work of aligning her identity with her practices, of becoming someone who naturally lived according to these principles. Together, these 5 principles had transformed not just her behavior, but her entire being. She was evidence that change was possible, that you could go from drowning to thriving, from scattered to focused, from exhausted to energized. But Emma also knew that this wasn't the end of her journey. Shitsuke, the final S, was a lifelong practice. There would always be new levels of integration, new challenges that tested her commitment, new opportunities to deepen her discipline. And that was okay. Actually, it was more than okay. It was exciting. Because she wasn't pursuing perfection, she was pursuing growth. And growth, by definition, never ends. As Emma prepared for bed, following her standardized evening routine, she felt a deep sense of peace. Not the peace of having arrived, but the peace of being on the right path, of knowing who she was and living in alignment with that truth. She thought about all the nurses who'd approached her after the conference, eager to begin their own transformation journeys. She thought about Bethany and David and all her colleagues back at St. Michael's who were experiencing the power of these principles. She thought about Walter and about Maria, the nurse who died too young because she'd never learned to create sustainable systems for self-care. Emma made a silent promise to Maria's memory. I will keep teaching this. I will keep showing healthcare workers and anyone else who will listen that you can be excellent without destroying yourself. That discipline isn't about deprivation, but about design. That the 5S principles aren't just about organization, but about creating lives worth living. With that promise in her heart, Emma turned off the light and drifted into peaceful sleep, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring. Because she knew that no matter what challenges arose, she had the tools, the systems, and, most importantly, the identity to handle them with grace, efficiency, and sustainability. The 5 Japanese rules for discipline had done more than organize her life. They'd transformed it. And through her, they would continue transforming the lives of countless others, rippling outward in ways Walter could never have imagined when he first started talking to a burned-out nurse in a hospital ICU one ordinary night. The journey wasn't over, but Emma was no longer the person who'd started it. She'd become someone new, someone stronger, someone clearer, someone disciplined not through force, but through choice, through identity, through love for herself and her work and her life. And that transformation, more than any organizational system or productivity hack, was the real magic of the 5 S's. Not just changing what you do, but transforming who you are. Chapter 4. The Legacy. Living the 5 Principles. 2 years had passed since that first night when Walter Chen had asked Emma Torres her name in the ICU of St. Michael's Medical Center. 2 years that felt like a lifetime, not because they'd been long, but because they'd been transformative. Emma was now 30 years old, and she barely recognized the person she'd been before. Not physically, she looked largely the same, but energetically, spiritually, fundamentally, she was different. The 5S principles had become so deeply woven into the fabric of her life that she couldn't imagine living any other way. It was a crisp autumn morning, and Emma was preparing for what would be one of the most significant days of her career. She'd been invited to lead a year-long training program for healthcare workers across the entire hospital network, 15 hospitals in total, on implementing the 5S principles for sustainable excellence. As she went through her morning routine, everything flowed with practiced ease. Wake at 5:30 a.m. 10 minutes of meditation. Shower. Dress in clothes she'd laid out the night before. Prepare a simple, nutritious breakfast. Review her schedule and intentions for the day. Out the door by 6:45 a.m. These weren't things she forced herself to do. They were expressions of who she'd become. An organized person, a disciplined person, a person who understood that how you start your day determines how you live your life. Driving to the hospital, Emma thought about how far the ripple effects of Walter's teaching had spread. It had started with just her, one burned-out nurse trying to find her way. Then it had spread to her colleagues in the ICU, then to other departments, then to other hospitals. Now, the program she'd developed, officially called the 5S Healthcare Initiative, Sustainable Systems for Sustainable Careers, was being implemented across the entire network. Hospital administrators had noticed something remarkable. Units that adopted these principles had lower staff turnover, fewer medical errors, higher patient satisfaction scores, and significantly reduced burnout rates. It wasn't magic. It was simply the power of teaching healthcare workers to sort what mattered, organize their workflows, maintain their spaces and themselves with daily attention, standardize their practices for consistency, and, most importantly, develop identities as professionals who could sustain excellence without sacrificing their humanity. When Emma arrived at the hospital, she went first to the ICU, as she always did. It was her grounding ritual, checking in on the place where her transformation had begun. The unit looked dramatically different from 2 years ago. Every station was organized according to the color-coded system Emma had developed. Supply closets were labeled and maintained. Charts and protocols were clearly posted. But more than the physical organization, there was a different energy. Calm instead of chaotic. Focused instead of frantic. Sarah, one of the nurses Emma had mentored early on, greeted her warmly. "Big day today, right? The network-wide kickoff?" Emma nodded, feeling butterflies in her stomach despite having done dozens of presentations by now. "Yeah, a little nervous, honestly." Sarah smiled. "You'll be amazing. You always are. And, Emma, I just want to say thank you. 2 years ago, I was ready to quit nursing. I couldn't handle the stress. Now, I love my job again, and it's because you showed me there was a different way." These moments never got old. Hearing how the principles had changed someone's life, had saved someone's career, had restored someone's sense of purpose. It reminded Emma why she'd committed to this work, why she'd promised Walter and Maria's memory that she'd keep teaching. The kickoff meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. in the hospital's largest auditorium. As Emma set up her presentation, healthcare workers began filing in. Nurses, doctors, technicians, administrators even, facility staff. Over 300 people in total, representatives from all 15 hospitals in the network. Margaret, who'd since been promoted to Chief Nursing Officer for the entire network, introduced Emma with words that made her tear up. 2 years ago, I watched a young nurse transform herself from burned out to brilliant. I watched her take ancient Japanese principles of organization and adapt them into a comprehensive system for healthcare excellence. Today, she's going to teach all of you what she taught us at St. Michael's. And I can promise you, if you embrace what she shares, it will change not just how you work, but how you live. Emma took the stage, took a deep breath, and began. Good morning. My name is Emma Torres, and I want to start by telling you something honest. 2 years ago, I hated my job. Not because nursing isn't meaningful. It is. Not because I didn't care about patients. I did. But because I was drowning. Drowning in chaos, in stress, in the feeling that no matter how hard I worked, it was never enough. How many of you have felt that way? Nearly every hand in the auditorium went up. Emma felt a wave of connection with these strangers who understood her struggle because they were living it too. I want to tell you that there is another way, Emma continued. A way to be excellent at your job without destroying yourself. A way to care deeply for others while also caring for yourself. And it starts with 5 simple principles. She walked them through the 5S system, but not in a dry academic way. She told stories. She shared her personal journey. She showed before and after examples. She demonstrated practical applications. And, most importantly, she addressed the inner transformation that made the outer changes sustainable. Seiri, sorting, isn't just about decluttering your workspace, Emma explained. It's about decluttering your life, your commitments, your relationships, your mental space. It's about having the courage to say, this doesn't serve me anymore, and I'm letting it go. Not because you're being selfish, but because you can't pour from an empty cup. You have to sort through what's draining you and what's sustaining you, and make conscious choices about where you put your limited energy. She saw heads nodding throughout the audience. People were connecting with this message. Seiton, setting in order, is about intentional design, she continued. It's not enough to know what matters. You have to organize your life in ways that make doing the right thing easy and doing the wrong thing hard. If you want to exercise, but you keep your workout clothes in the back of a closet, you're designing for failure. If you want to eat healthy, but you stock your pantry with junk food, you're designing for failure. Seiton is about looking at every aspect of your life and asking, is this set up to support my goals or undermine them? Emma moved to the next principle. Seiso, shining, is the practice of daily maintenance. It's understanding that everything deteriorates without attention. Your workspace, your relationships, your health, your mental clarity. Seiso teaches you that small, consistent actions prevent major problems. 10 minutes of daily attention prevents hours of crisis management. This is where discipline lives, not in big dramatic efforts, but in the small, consistent actions you take every single day. She could feel the energy in the room shifting. People weren't just listening anymore. They were internalizing, imagining how this could apply to their lives. Seiketsu, standardization, is about making your good practices sustainable, Emma explained. It's about creating systems, routines, and structures that support you even when motivation fails. Because here's the truth: motivation is unreliable. It comes and goes. You can't build a sustainable life on motivation alone. You need systems, checklists, routines, protocols, things that guide you to do the right thing even when you don't feel like it. Finally, Emma came to the last principle, the one she'd come to see as the most profound. And then there's Shitsuke, self-discipline. This is the hardest one to explain because it's not really about doing anything. It's about becoming someone. It's the shift from "I'm trying to be organized" to "I am organized." From "I should take care of myself" to "I am someone who takes care of myself." This is where all the other principles culminate. This is where discipline stops being something you practice and becomes who you are. Emma paused, making eye contact with various people in the audience. I'm not telling you this transformation is easy. It's not. I'm not telling you it's quick. It's not. What I'm telling you is that it's possible. I'm living proof. And so are dozens of people at St. Michael's who've embraced these principles. We're healthier, happier, more effective at our jobs, and more present in our lives. Not because we're special, but because we committed to a process of continuous improvement. She ended her presentation with a challenge. Over the next year, I'm going to work with teams at each of your hospitals to implement these principles. But the real work isn't what happens in our training sessions. It's what happens every day when you choose to sort, organize, maintain, standardize, and sustain. It's what happens when you decide that you're worth the effort, that your well-being matters just as much as patient care, that you can't be excellent long-term if you're running on empty. The applause was thunderous. As Emma left the stage, she was immediately surrounded by people wanting to talk, to ask questions, to share their own struggles and hopes for change. One older doctor, probably in his early 60s, waited patiently until the crowd thinned, then approached Emma. "I've been practicing medicine for 35 years, he said quietly, "and I've never heard anyone articulate what you just said, about discipline being about identity, not just behavior. That's profound. That's what's been missing from every wellness program I've ever seen." Emma felt deeply moved. "Thank you. That means a lot, especially coming from someone with your experience." "Can I ask you something?" the doctor continued. "What made this stick for you when so many organizational systems fail? What was the difference?" Emma thought carefully before answering. "I think it's because this wasn't just about productivity or efficiency. It was about survival. I was drowning, and these principles gave me something to hold on to. But more than that, I had a teacher, a patient named Walter, who didn't just give me techniques. He helped me understand the philosophy behind them, the why, not just the how. And that made all the difference." The doctor nodded thoughtfully. "Where is this Walter now? I'd love to meet him." Emma's smile was bittersweet. "He passed away about 6 months ago, peacefully in his sleep. But before he died, he knew about this program. He knew his teachings were spreading, and he told me that was the greatest gift I could have given him, knowing that his wife's memory was being honored by helping people avoid her fate." "Then we'll honor both their memories," the doctor said, extending his hand. "By doing this work, by spreading these principles, by showing that healthcare workers can sustain long, healthy careers without burning out." Over the following months, Emma traveled to each of the 15 hospitals in the network, spending several days at each location. She worked directly with staff, helping them implement the 5S principles in their specific contexts. Every hospital was different. Every department had unique challenges, but the core principles remained the same. She saw remarkable transformations. At one hospital, the emergency department had been notorious for high staff turnover and frequent errors. After implementing 5S principles, turnover dropped by 60% in 6 months, and error rates declined significantly. Staff reported feeling more in control, less stressed, more capable of handling the inherent chaos of emergency medicine. At another hospital, the surgical unit had been struggling with supply management issues that occasionally delayed procedures. The Seiton principle of setting everything in order revolutionized their processes. Color-coded systems, clearly labeled storage, standardized protocols, everything had its place, and everyone knew where everything was. Delays became rare, efficiency improved, and surgeons consistently reported higher satisfaction with their work environment. But the changes Emma witnessed weren't just organizational, they were personal. She met nurse after nurse, doctor after doctor, who told her that these principles had saved not just their careers, but their lives, their marriages, their relationships with their children, their health, their sense of self. One nurse, a woman named Patricia, who'd been on the verge of divorce because she was never present at home, told Emma through tears, "My husband said I'd become a ghost. I was physically there, but mentally still at the hospital." Learning to sort, to set boundaries between work and home, to maintain my personal relationships with the same attention I gave to patient care, it brought me back to my family. We're reconnecting. My kids are getting their mom back. I can't thank you enough. These stories fueled Emma. On difficult days, when she was tired from travel or frustrated with resistance to change, she'd remember why this work mattered. Every person who reclaimed their life, every career saved from burnout, every family that stayed together because someone learned to create balance, it all mattered profoundly. Emma also continued her own practice of the 5S principles, because she understood that she couldn't teach what she wasn't living. Every week, she did her sorting review. Every day, she maintained her spaces and systems. Every month, she evaluated and adjusted her standardized routines. And continuously, she worked on deepening her identity as a disciplined, organized, intentional person. One evening, about 18 months into the network-wide program, Emma was in her apartment preparing for a presentation the next day. Her phone rang. It was Margaret. "Emma, I have some news, Margaret said, her voice carrying an emotion Emma couldn't quite identify. The hospital network's board of directors met today. They've been reviewing the outcomes of the 5S healthcare initiative. Emma felt her stomach tighten. Please let it be good news, she thought. The results are extraordinary, Margaret continued. Across all 15 hospitals, we're seeing an average 45% reduction in staff turnover. Patient satisfaction scores are up an average of 23%. Medical error rates are down 31%. And most remarkably, staff well-being scores have improved by an average of 58%. Emma, this is unprecedented. Emma felt tears streaming down her face. I don't even know what to say. There's more, Margaret said, and now Emma could hear the smile in her voice. The board has approved funding to expand this program. They want to create a 5S training center here at St. Michael's. They want to bring in healthcare workers from other networks, other states, to learn these principles. And Emma, they want you to lead it, full-time, with a team. This would be your entire job, teaching these principles and helping healthcare organizations implement them. Emma was speechless. This was beyond anything she'd imagined. What had started as one patient teaching one burned-out nurse had grown into something that could potentially transform healthcare culture across the country. I don't know if I'm qualified, Emma finally said. I'm just a nurse who learned some organizational principles. No, Margaret corrected firmly. You're a transformational leader who took profound wisdom and made it practical and accessible. You're exactly the person for this role. So what do you say? Emma thought about Walter, about Maria, about every healthcare worker she'd met who was struggling, about the potential to help thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people, create sustainable, meaningful careers. Yes, she said. Absolutely yes. The 5S Healthcare Training Center opened 6 months later. It was housed in a renovated wing of St. Michael's Hospital, designed according to 5S principles, of course. Everything was organized, efficient, beautiful in its simplicity and functionality. Emma hired a small team, including Bethany, who'd grown into an excellent teacher in her own right. Together, they developed comprehensive curricula for different healthcare roles and settings. Nurses, doctors, administrators, support staff, everyone had tailored training that applied the 5S principles to their specific contexts. The center offered everything from one-day introductory workshops to multi-month deep implementation programs. Healthcare workers came from across the country and eventually internationally to learn these principles. Emma also started a podcast called Sustainable Excellence, where she interviewed healthcare workers who'd transformed their lives and careers through the 5S principles. The podcast grew rapidly, reaching hundreds of thousands of listeners who found hope and practical guidance in the stories shared. She wrote a book, The 5 S's, Japanese Principles for Sustainable Excellence in Healthcare and Life, which became a bestseller in healthcare management and self-help categories. Royalties from the book were donated to a scholarship fund Emma had created in Walter and Maria's names, supporting nursing students who demonstrated commitment to sustainable practice. But despite all this success, all this growth and recognition, Emma never forgot where she'd started. She still worked shifts in the ICU once a month. She needed that connection to patient care, to remember why this work mattered. She needed to stay grounded in the reality of healthcare work, not just theorizing about it from an office. On the second anniversary of Walter's death, Emma organized a memorial event at the training center. She invited everyone who'd been touched by the 5S program, staff from all 15 network hospitals, participants in the training center programs, listeners of her podcast. Over 500 people attended. Emma stood before them and told Walter's story. She told them about Maria, the nurse who died too young from burnout. She explained how one patient's wisdom, shared during recovery from heart surgery, had sparked a movement that was now changing healthcare culture. "Walter taught me that discipline isn't about restriction," Emma said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's about freedom. Freedom from chaos. Freedom from overwhelm. Freedom to be excellent at your work while still having energy left for your life. He taught me the 5 S's, and through living them, I discovered something profound. When you sort your life, organize your priorities, maintain your well-being, standardize your practices, and sustain your discipline through identity, you don't just become more productive, you become more human, more present, more alive." She paused, looking out at the crowd of healthcare workers who'd all, in various ways, been transformed by these principles. "Walter once told me that he shared these teachings because he hoped I could help others avoid his wife's fate. He hoped that by learning to create sustainable systems, healthcare workers could have long, healthy, fulfilling careers. As I look at all of you today, I believe we're honoring that hope. We're proving that it's possible. We're living evidence that the helping professions don't have to destroy the helpers." The room erupted in applause. Emma saw tears on many faces. She understood. This wasn't just about organization or productivity. This was about reclaiming humanity in a system that often demanded you sacrifice yourself on the altar of care. After the memorial event, Emma spent time talking with attendees. One conversation particularly stuck with her. A young nurse, probably just a year or two out of school, approached her nervously. "Miss Torres, I just wanted to say thank you. I started following the 5S principles 3 months ago after I heard about your program. I was already feeling burned out, and I'd only been nursing for 18 months. I thought maybe I'd made a mistake choosing this career. But these principles, they've changed everything. I'm sleeping better. I'm not dreading work. I actually feel hopeful again." Emma took the young nurse's hand. "What's your name?" "Melissa." "Melissa, you didn't make a mistake choosing nursing. Nursing chose you for a reason. But here's what I want you to remember. Taking care of yourself isn't selfish. It's essential. You can't pour from an empty cup. The 5S principles aren't just about being more efficient. They're about creating a life that sustains you so you can sustain others. Promise me you'll keep practicing them, especially on hard days when it feels like too much effort." Melissa nodded, tears in her eyes. "I promise." Watching Melissa walk away, Emma felt the weight and privilege of what she'd been given. Walter's wisdom wasn't just information, it was a legacy a gift meant to be passed forward, person to person, generation to generation. That night, in her apartment, Emma sat at her desk and opened her journal. She'd been keeping this journal for the entire 2 years of her transformation, documenting her journey, her insights, her struggles and victories. She wrote, "2 years ago, Walter asked me my name in an ICU. Today, over 500 people gathered to honor his memory and the principles he taught me. The 5 S's have spread further than I ever imagined. They've helped thousands of healthcare workers. They've changed hospital systems. They've saved careers and probably, indirectly, lives. But the most important thing they've done is this. They've proven that discipline doesn't have to be punishing, that organization doesn't have to be rigid, that excellence doesn't require self-destruction, that you can be deeply dedicated to helping others while also taking care of yourself. Seiri taught me discernment, what to keep and what to release. Seiton taught me intentionality, how to organize life to support my goals. Seiso taught me maintenance, that daily attention prevents major problems. Seiketsu taught me sustainability, how to create systems that last. And Shitsuke taught me integration, how to transform discipline from doing into being. Together, these 5 principles didn't just change my behavior, they changed my identity. They transformed me from someone who was drowning to someone who's thriving. From someone who was scattered to someone who's focused. From someone who was burned out to someone who's on fire with purpose. And the most beautiful part? This transformation is available to anyone willing to commit to the process. Anyone willing to sort, organize, maintain, standardize, and sustain. Anyone willing to do the work of becoming someone who lives these principles naturally. Emma closed her journal and looked around her apartment, every item in its place, every system functioning smoothly. But more than the physical organization, there was peace, deep, abiding peace. The peace that comes from living in alignment with your values, from knowing who you are and living accordingly. She thought about where she'd been 2 years ago, exhausted, overwhelmed, lost. And she thought about where she was now, energized, purposeful, found. The journey had been challenging. There had been setbacks, moments of doubt, times when maintaining discipline felt like too much effort. But she'd persisted, and the result was a life she genuinely loved, a career that fulfilled her, relationships that nourished her, a sense of self that was solid and clear. Emma walked to her window and looked out at the city lights. Somewhere out there were thousands of healthcare workers on night shifts, caring for patients, giving everything they had. Some of them were thriving, sustained by good systems and healthy boundaries. Others were drowning, just like she had been, not yet knowing there was another way. For those who were drowning, Emma had a message, the same message Walter had given her. There is another way. You don't have to sacrifice yourself to care for others. You can be excellent and sustainable. You can be dedicated and balanced. You can help others without destroying yourself. It starts with sorting. What matters and what doesn't? What serves your highest good and what drains you? Then organizing, giving everything its proper place, designing your life to support your goals. Then maintaining, daily attention. Small, consistent actions that prevent big problems. Then standardizing. Creating systems and routines that make right actions easy and wrong actions hard. And finally, sustaining. Becoming someone who naturally lives according to these principles. Transforming discipline. From practice into identity. 5 principles, 5 steps, 1 transformed life. And the potential for millions of transformed lives as the message spread. Emma felt deep gratitude for Walter, for Maria's memory that had motivated his teaching, for every person who'd embraced these principles and spread them further, for the privilege of being part of this movement toward sustainable excellence in healthcare. She made herself a promise, the same promise she'd made to Walter and renewed every day since. She would keep teaching these principles, keep showing people there was another way, keep honoring the gift she'd been given by passing it forward as generously as it had been given to her. Because that's what Shitsuke, sustaining discipline, really meant at the highest level. Not just sustaining your own practice, but sustaining the movement, ensuring that the wisdom doesn't die with you, but continues flowing outward, touching lives, transforming careers, changing culture. Emma turned from the window and prepared for bed, following her evening routine with practiced ease. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to teach, new lives to touch with these principles. And she was ready, not because she was perfect, but because she'd become someone who showed up consistently, who maintained her practices daily, who lived according to her values. She'd become disciplined, not through force or willpower alone, but through identity, through the slow, steady work of transformation that had turned 5 Japanese principles into a way of life. And as she drifted off to sleep in her organized, peaceful apartment, Emma knew that Walter would be proud, that Maria's memory was being honored, that the legacy was secure and growing. The 5 S's weren't just changing individual lives anymore. They were changing healthcare culture, one person at a time, one hospital at a time, one transformed life rippling outward to touch countless others. This was the power of discipline properly understood, not as punishment or restriction, but as liberation, as the path to sustainable excellence, as the way to be extraordinary without becoming exhausted. And Emma Torres, once a burned-out nurse on the edge of quitting, was now living proof that transformation was not only possible, but teachable. That anyone, absolutely anyone, could go from drowning to thriving by learning to sort, organize, maintain, standardize, and sustain. The journey had begun with a simple question in an ICU. "What's your name?" It had evolved into a movement that was changing thousands of lives. And it would continue evolving, spreading, growing, touching more and more people who needed to know that there was another way, a better way, a sustainable way. 5 Japanese rules for discipline, infinite possibilities for transformation. One life at a time. That was the legacy. That was the gift. That was the promise that Emma Torres would spend the rest of her career fulfilling. And somewhere, she liked to imagine, Walter and Maria were watching, smiling, knowing that their story had become part of something much bigger than themselves, something that would outlive them all, something that would continue helping people for generations to come. The 5 S's: simple principles, profound impact, sustainable excellence. That was the message. That was the mission. That was the legacy that would never end.